Today, as we move on, we're going to think just for a moment about our agenda. And we want to encourage you to follow along in your program where you'll be able to learn more about each of our presenters and the work they do. And in order to give the maximum amount of time to our speakers, we're not going to read their bios, but leave you to do that on your own. It is absolutely my pleasure at this point to turn the mic over to Tia Wong and Kelsey Friesen from our partnering organization for this forum, Students for Consent Culture Canada, for our first presentation, Envisioning Safety on Post-Secondary Campuses. How did we get here and where are we going? Tia and Kelsey?
Hi there. Okay, are we ready to go? Okay. There we go. I'm just gonna set up. I can't see Kelsey, but I can see myself, so we'll leave it at that. Well, thank you everyone for coming. We'll jump right into our slides here. So I'm Tia Wong. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the co-chairs of Students for Consent Culture, which is one of the co-organizers of this event. And we're really excited to be here. Like I said, there's too many people. I can't see Kelsey, but I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Kelsey, and I'm here, by the way, Tia. I can see you, not sure why you can't see me, but yeah, she, her pronouns, and I'm the outreach lead with SFCC.
Great, okay. So we're just gonna start off with a short land acknowledgement for our personal territory. So I'm joining today as a grateful visitor on unceded Algonquin territory, colonially known as Ottawa. Being a settler in the capital city, especially right now, of this colonial state that we exist in, is a constant reminder of the ongoing violence that is enacted on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And it's really punctuated by the knowledge that Parliament Hill and these other structures of the Canadian government and other governments literally sit on this unsurrendered Algonquin land. And so I wanted to bring that into this space today.
Yeah, and then I wanted to say a little bit for me too. I'm joining from the traditional and ancestral territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux of Treaty 6. So I'm in Edmonton. I'm thankful for the ability to live, work, and play on the land. And then I also just wanted to recognize that we are gathered by an institution with a colonial history and colonial present. And I aim to continually lessen the ongoing colonial harms through speaking about them and through taking action. Okay, so a little bit just about SFCC. So Students for Consent Culture Canada, or SFCC for short. We're basically an organization dedicated to supporting intersectional and grassroots anti-sexual violence policy, advocacy, and activism on campuses across Canada. And we kind of serve as a hub of resources, tools, and institutional memory for student survivors and leaders to engage with.
I keep clicking it at the same time as you. Yeah, so a little bit of a history of our organization if you're not familiar and haven't been along the journey with us. So SFCC began with a group of students who were organizing in Ontario and Quebec, trying to address sexual violence and what they saw as a lack of institutional accountability and just general rape culture on their campuses. A culminating moment came in 2017 when student organizers wrote an open letter with over 2,500 student signatories and the support of over 100 student groups. Together, they led a walkout of over 1,000 students during exams from McGill and Concordia in Montreal, protesting the inaction of their respective administrations. And it was around this time that what's now known as SFCC published the Our Turn National Action Plan, which demanded that institutions be accountable to students And we provided best practices for sexual violence policies that really reflected the needs of survivors and students at the time. And the release of this action plan was actually just a few days or a week or so before the #MeToo movement, which was started by Tarana Burke, but before it kind of exploded into the mainstream media. So it was very kind of perfect timing, I guess you could say.
Yeah, so I only joined the organization this past June, but SFCC has done a lot over the course of its existence. So just wanted to highlight a couple of the bigger things that SFCC has done. So in 2018, we supported the Student Society of McGill University in building their sexualized and gender-based violence policy. And then in 2019, we wrote the Moving Beyond Potential lobby document for the British Columbia government. Between 2019 and 2020, we developed and executed the research portion of the Open Secrets report, which is a report that essentially explores the ongoing issue of professor-perpetrated sexual violence. And then finally, in 2021, we had different members of SFCC contribute to the federal government's National Action Plan to end gender-based violence by hosting consultation sessions. And we'll be sharing our findings from that publicly through the Crucial Voices report, which actually comes out later this month.
Great. So our role in the movement, what we've been working on since our inception has included training and educational resources for student groups, lobbying and consultation with various governments, supporting students in grading their institution sexual violence policies, which is something that was kind of spearheaded in the Our Turn National Action Report of 2017. We've produced a zine containing poetry, art, student stories, recipes, and other fun stuff, and we plan to do more of those. We've supported students in making progress and achieving success in their campus movements. And then we're working on a lot of stuff that hasn't come out yet as well, such as the education toolkit, where we'll be consulting with students and creating consent training resources for them to use on campuses, an advocacy toolkit, which will give tools to students to advocate on their campuses and various levels of government. We have the Open Secrets Power and Professors report, which is coming out soon, eventually. We are working on a campaign right now and collecting graduate student experiences through a Google form that you can submit to, which we will use to create various other resources similar to everything listed here. We are working on different speaker series, as well as regrading policies and growing our membership. And we may also have a webinar coming up this year on NDAs. Okay, just trying to keep up with the chat at the same time. Yeah, so there's a lot that we do as an organization, but what really sets us apart is our focus on community care, mutual aid, and building networks based on deep relationships and trust. And having a strong commitment to our values can make this work come very slowly, but it also makes for better work that isn't just focused on productivity. And I think that's an important role to play by modeling the kind of community that we want to be a part of.
Okay, so over the last several years, obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about sexual violence policies on campus. So we just wanted to talk a little bit about that. We at SFCC here, we advocate for the absolute bare minimum policies that essentially create a standard care for survivors and that all members of campus communities are included in the policy language. For years, those involved in the labor movement and anti-violence work, and then in addition to other advocates and allies, have fought really hard to put the policies that we have currently into place. And this work continues today because there are still a lot of campuses across Canada that don't have a sexual violence standalone policy. So as an organization of students and allies who strongly believe in survivor agency, having policy as a tool plays a role in showing that we can build new pathways and options with the best interests of survivors in mind. But with all of that said, we want to be very clear that the standard of care we advocate for cannot rely solely on policy. So it is a really great tool that we can use, but it's not the only tool that we can use to create these safe campuses. We also need to do things like educate our students on what healthy and unhealthy relationships look like, maybe even what ongoing consent looks like, how to prevent sexual violence from happening in the first place through things like bystander intervention methods. Just because we've seen some colleges and universities do some pretty crappy things, for lack of a better word, with their policies. So we've seen some campuses use their policies as a way to say, all right, there we go. We've made this policy. We've addressed campus sexual violence. We showed that we care. Good enough. But there's so much more than that that's needed. We've also seen some colleges and universities use consultation and policy processes to purposely burn out student activists, offering policy as kind of a red herring rather than an actual agent of change. So what we've really been asking ourselves lately is, who is this policy for? Because we've mostly seen policies aimed at protecting institutional reputation. We found that they care more about the rights of perpetrators than survivors, and a lot of them even mimic carceral systems of response. So ultimately, from our own experiences and those of survivors and students that we support, we found that if anti-sexual violence work or anti-discrimination work or anti-harassment work is being done by an institution, it does not seek to shift or totally disrupt systems of power, it'll not work. So finally, we have seen that policy creation does not guarantee that the policy is properly implemented or properly used in avoiding that re-traumatization of survivors.
So one example we can give is Dalhousie, which was featured in our 2019 One Year Later report. So some amazing student leaders and friends of SFCC worked with the university administration and staff to completely transform their sexual violence policy, bumping their D+ scorecard into an A+. So that was based on the scorecard that's in the Our Turn National Action Plan from 2017. So this was an amazing victory for the Dalhousie community. You can see all the smiling faces in this picture after the success. But in the years since, we have seen that rape culture persists on their campus. I didn't want to bring too many specific examples, but we see this a lot at various institutions where policy isn't everything. Go to the next slide. Okay. Yeah, so at SFCC, we've begun to frame sexual violence not as a policy issue, but as a cultural issue. Institutional cultures support gender-based violence through systems of oppression, including ongoing colonialism, sexism, racism, white supremacy, ableism, and normalized abuses of power that will not be addressed through policies. Instead, we need a dedicated commitment to changing the cultures that allow for these systems of oppression to continue in our communities and on campuses. So why are we here today? We wanted to take some time to reflect on why we specifically as members of SFCC and as people have continued to be committed to this work. So for me, I joined this movement and specifically the organization SFCC as a young feminist who wanted to make a difference. I thought it was a great cause that so many of my friends and people at school were impacted by, so it felt really close to home. And I've stayed in this organization for almost 4 years, past the point of being a student actually, because of the community who I've learned so much from as an activist, organizer, community member, and human being. And being with these folks just gives me hope for a better world in all respects when I see that what we can accomplish together and from learning from each other.
Yeah, and then I joined this movement as a bright-eyed first-year undergrad in 2015. And there's a really long story behind how I got here, but I'm just going to try and keep it short today. So basically, I've spent the last 7 years doing research. I've been advocating, organizing, just trying to understand why colleges and universities in Canada respond the way that they do and to push them to do better. So when I joined SFCC this past June, I joined because of its unique approach to work that we just talked about a couple of minutes ago. And this sounds very corny, and I'm not a corny person at all, but I have to say it. I've truly never been a member of a more compassionate, patient, but also fun-loving team who all have the same goal, and that is to end sexual violence on our campuses. So as a whole, SFCC as the organization is here because we believe that sharing perspectives on anti-violence and consent is really important to help build collective understanding. We focus a lot on, or we focus particularly on student voices and always strive to give space to voices that are often ignored or marginalized. So by learning from each other in this forum, we are strengthening our ability to build better futures for our communities.
And finally, doesn't matter which slide, just we want to continue talking about why we are all here today and why we hope that so many of you have joined this this event today. And to kind of answer that question, we can take a look at recent events or semi-recent events, tragic events at University of Western Ontario and St. FX on the East Coast and all across the country that have happened since the beginning of last term in September of 2021 that have reminded us that this work is far from over. So at both Western and at St. FX, among others, following these events, the institutions responded by putting out a statement that essentially said, you know, we care about students, we care about survivors, and then in tandem with that, kind of increased security and policing on campuses, and that was kind of it. In terms of the institutional response, obviously there's been grassroots response from students and organizations in the community, but institutions have proven time and again that they can identify the violence that happens to students and other members of the campus community, but they have not undertaken the actual work of stopping it. So this has led to institutional betrayal that compounds the trauma that survivors already carry. And in response to this, we wanted to make space for those here to investigate and envision what a proper response to these events looks like and what we can do all the time, every day, not just when something bad happens, to prevent violence, care for each other, and reduce harm. So we hope through this forum that we're able to discover some of the answers to the questions like, what does safety really mean? What are the ways that administrators, community groups, and students can promote safety on campuses? And how do we protect our community from sexual violence without enforcing systems of oppression that exist? So thank you for listening. That's all we have for today. We've listed here our social media, how you can get in contact with us, and our website. We also have the newsletter that you can sign up for at the bottom of our website front page. We also have a new membership model. So if you are interested in joining this movement and specifically our organization, I've sent the link in the chat. With a small donation or for free, you can join as a volunteer or a voting member of the organization and stay up to date on what we're working on. Yeah, so thanks so much. I think there's one more slide. Yes, our next presenter is a lovely friend of SFCC, Dr. Emily Rosser, who is presenting her presentation, Trust Your Gut and Do It Yourself, Resisting Securitization and Co-Optation in Post-Secondary Institutions. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Emily. Thank you for all being here. I'm checking what's going on in the chat, and I do think that something needs to be addressed before I go on. I'm not sure if there's anyone who wants to hop in here, but a lot of people are expressing the difficulty watching an elder be cut off from a traditional opening and sort of working through what we should be doing about it. So I'm just wondering if we could maybe
Emily,
deal with that first, please.
Emily, we're just in the process of putting something into the chat, but I really appreciate your invitation to do so. This is Linda, and I am the one that made that error and I intervened with Norma. I have placed a call into Norma and will follow up with her. I was struggling and obviously made the wrong decision, and I apologize for that, but we will work that through by sharing that apology and asking Norma what she needs us to do to make that right. And again, I'm very sorry for the decision that I made at that time.
Thanks, Linda. I think that there is an opportunity to have a larger conversation about, accountability in this work and, the practices that we engage in, particularly around sort of having enough time. And I feel pretty uncomfortable continuing here, but I do also want to recognize how many people are participating at the moment and the potential that there is for us to continue that conversation about accountability as well. So I do want to present, and I do want to first of all acknowledge and thank Norma for that beautiful grounding of our work. It calmed me and it made me feel like I was participating in something, really big and important. And I'd like to continue in that vein. So I do acknowledge that this was upsetting for a lot of people. A lot of folks have left. I would like to continue and put it out there that maybe we can figure out a way to have a conversation in a different way, in a different forum. So I am joining from Windsor in the territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. And I am very excited about the potential for discussion and the work that is happening around decolonization, the questions around whether we can even talk about consent on Indigenous land. And that is sort of where I will jump off from. So thank you. And I hope that we can sort of continue with this. So my presentation comes from a place of humility, I would say, and having been involved in anti-violence activism for quite a long time on campuses, so almost 20 years. I've left academia for reasons, and that gives you some clarity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some work around thinking through what securitization means, and looking at how we can imagine alternatives to securitization approaches to gender-based violence on our campuses. Okay. And I do appreciate what's going on in the chat. I'm so grateful and proud to be here. And I do actually, I'm gonna leave the chat so I can actually see my slides, but I will catch up after. So my presentation is called Trust Your Gut and Do It Yourselves. It's about resisting securitization and co-optation on your campus. And basically, I just want to talk a little bit about what is securitization in relation to gender-based violence, what enables it, why now, what is abolition, why are we talking about getting police and security out of this movement, how can you resist, some ideas for building accessible, legible, and effective campus movements. And then I am going to highlight some things that came out of the Crucial Voices report from student participants in the National Action Plan consultations that SFCC coordinated last year. And that report has just dropped, or will drop later this month. So thank you. So first of all, what do we mean by securitization? A lot of people think about it like drawing on a lot of security guards and sort of beefing up policing in response to perceived threats of violence. I think about it as a process through which ordinary people and communities are sidelined and disempowered by those in positions of power. So I first started thinking about this concept as a grad student at York University when there was a series of gang rapes at a residence. So this was like a case study in the different dimensions of securitization, rather than listening to what students were asking for. The university first responded by minimizing or covering up the event, then with victim blaming, then with scapegoating of racialized communities in the area, and then co-opting a safety audit that was demanded by student organizing. So I learned a lot from this and other activism. The thing that stuck with me is that so many people in charge engage in narratives about safety and security, but they don't make us safer. So it's important to ask who and what is being secured when we rely on police and security guards to respond to violence on campus. So I would argue elites, existing orders of power, property, colonialism. This type of approach thrives in settings where people are isolated from each other, where there is a value placed on hierarchy, patriarchy, racism, convention, and compliance. So these things, not student safety, are the bottom line in that kind of approach. Post-secondary admin often seek to control the narrative and the explanations for why violence happens. So they talk about bad lighting, bad victims, bad luck, bad apples, maybe bad policy, but almost never bad culture. They rarely operate in ways informed by trauma or groups most affected by policing. And scapegoating marginalized groups is a huge part of this approach. That includes weaponizing some people's vulnerabilities against others in order to rationalize force and over-policing. So Black feminists tell us that historically, the perceived vulnerability of white women was used to criminalize Black and racialized men. And this pattern continues today. So not just in the sort of Karen calling 911 trope videos, although those are a really important way that people have understood this who haven't conventionally understood this, but also in so-called feminist efforts to prevent gender violence by leaning on law enforcement. So anyway, securitization, what's missing in this securitized worldview is community. And I mentioned that it's a process. What that means is that we can unbuild it. It's something that became and it can unbecome. It's not just the way things are. So I do want to talk about thinking through these issues, not just what is securitization, but also what is the opposite of it? What isn't it? What is the opposite of rape culture? And this is a book that I've discovered recently. It's by Nora Samran, and it's called Turn This World Inside Out. Nora Samran tells us that the opposite of rape culture is nurturance culture. So this is what many of us are enacting in our lives currently. So we have to go bigger than policy and theory. We have to enact practices of care that scaffold everything else that we're doing in our anti-violence work. So I want to start this off just thinking not only about how we define this sort of concept or this idea of policing and securitization, but also what is the opposite? What is the opposite of rape culture beyond the absence of those things? So I want to propose that it's the generative possibility of other forms of power, community, belonging, and care. And any prevention work that does not center survivors and this sense of care is not enough. So that's sort of my starting point. And why now? Why are we talking about abolition now? Getting cops off campus, not leaning on security in anti-violence work? I would argue that there is so much history of organizing and resistance to policing across so many movements. And there's a lot of potential for cross-movement and cross-identity organizing. There's a lot more mainstream consciousness about defunding police at the moment, thanks to the movement for Black Lives and a lot of the organizing that was happening since 2020, but we still have a lot of work to do. So this is a good moment. I hope you enjoy my collage. And it's a moment. So how do we start organizing together? You don't have to be experts, you just have to start, and we all learn as we go. So one way to start that I like thinking about is called a feminist snap. So this comes from Sarah Ahmed. Again, I will put these books in the chat at the end if you like. This is the ex-teacher in me. This is from Living a Feminist Life, which is an awesome book and approach. Ahmed basically talks about how you sometimes get to this point in your life where you snap. It's a line in the sand. And what I want you to think about is, what is your feminist snap on your campus? Snaps can help us sort of mobilize action, and they can help us raise consciousness with a lot of people who may not be on the same page as us about gender-based violence. So what is that for you? That's something to think about when you start organizing. I know we're talking at Western University, and I would suggest that an event where 50 to 100 undergrads got roofied in the first week of school would be one of those events, right? I really last fall saw people snap, they organized, they got together, they demonstrated, they walked out, they made demands, and here we are. This is a really good example of a way to harness the urgency of a moment and to bring it to the table. So a feminist snap, it's not a movement, it's a moment. It's a very important thing to start out with. So that's something that I wanted to bring as a possibility. When we organize together in alliances or coalitions around gender-based violence and desecuritizing, what are we looking to do? I would argue the first thing is we need to organize in coalitions. People are not going to be coming with the same understanding of gender-based violence or the same understanding of policing and criminal justice. That doesn't mean you can't work together, but it does mean you have to learn from each other, and don't underestimate the differences in your different approaches. That's not to say everybody should just give up on their own perspectives. And it doesn't mean work with people who are kind of like racist or whatever. That's not what I'm saying at all. I would 100% throw out the bad work and start from scratch a million times over, if that's the case. But there are a lot of people you can work with and develop concrete shared goals and benchmarks together. So if you have those things, then you can operate, you can inspire people, right? And there's ways to sort of keep track of where you're going rather than just a big commitment to like getting cops off campus, even though that is awesome. Multiple tactics, definitely. You have a big tent, you're not gonna have people with the same level of privilege, vulnerability, or skills. That could be a strength if you recognize and strategize around it. I'm sorry, a lot of talking. So there's some examples on the slide. The next thing I would say is think about redistributing risk. So taking an accomplice approach to politics means people who can afford to get arrested or who won't get deported if they lose their student status should take more risks in direct action and confrontation with power. So this politics of accomplices, not allies, is an excellent approach to start organizing around privilege in coalition organizing. But redistributing risk doesn't mean those with privilege call the shots. So it's important to figure out this distinction if you are going to work together. One of the best ways that I've ever organized is anonymously. And I think this is because a lot of the time as a survivor and as groups of survivors, it can be very scary to be public about being a sexual violence survivor. You can get isolated. There's a lot of backlash. You can get re-traumatized. So there's a real strength in thinking about guerrilla tactics, stickering campaigns, yeah, lots of things we can talk about later, but basically the idea that you could be anyone and you could be everywhere is, it turns the fear back on the people who are creating that environment for you. So it can be very powerful to organize in that way. Other than that, there's a couple more things I wanted to sort of touch on here, but I'm gonna move pretty fast. So have confidence in survivors as experts. Stay nimble, but think sustainable. So basically what that means is, you gotta build around care. What that means is organizing for the long term, not just the short term. Make it possible for people to tap in and out without burning out. And know what you will say and what your priorities are if you do ever get invited to a table. Maybe your priority is saying goodbye. But that's okay. So I just wanted to move now to the Crucial Voices report and to talk about this for a second. Basically, we now have data. That's something really important for students and survivors who organize and who are constantly being dismissed. We know how important it is to have data to back up what we're saying and, not be called anecdotal or hysterical or whatever those other misogynistic things that people call survivors. And it's important to have our data. So to collect what we believe is important and to frame it in the way that we believe is important. So we've been building research capacity at SFCC for a couple years. Crucial Voices was part of the National Action Plan consultations, and Open Secrets, which we now have a summary report of, not the full report, but check it out. That is about faculty sexual violence. I'm very excited about that. Okay, so, and I'm seeing the audio is not working for some people. I'm really sorry. I hope that we can fix that. I am talking super loud. Anyway, so in the Crucial Voices process, we had students participate in surveys, focus groups, and interviews. And basically between the Open Secrets research in 2020 and the Crucial Voices in 2021, we see actually student participants are getting a lot more familiar and curious about abolition and alternatives to policing and security. We're not seeing everybody share the same perspective, but this shows a lot of potential for these this work at the moment. So that's why I want to pull it out of that report. I'm not going to go over this, but Crucial Voices, shameless plug, go look at the report. There's lots of good data and quotes in there from students about sexual violence on campus across Canada. And what we've said is there are these priorities that we have pulled out of this consultation process. What we've seen is that students are talking about how resources should be allocated and reallocated to the work against sexual violence on campus, to intersectional work, broad-based, trauma-informed work. So what we're seeing is something much bigger than just saying, let's not have policing or let's not have security. It's a whole paradigm shift in people understanding what we want to see around sexual violence prevention and support. So what students said about security and policing. Some were supportive of a role for security and gender-based violence response. I'm not going to pretend everybody is the biggest radical anti-police activist, but most people qualified that with something. So many called for better knowledge and training, more prevention education rather than reactive responses. investing in more services and supports, resources, promoting viable alternatives, clear pathways to if students want to go to police or not. A lot of people express serious concern about police histories of oppression, especially racism and gender-based violence. And people talked about the lack of diversity, the history of violence among police and security, and how that leads to a lack of trust and low reporting rates. Others said there's no evidence that security reduces violence or has students' interests at heart. And this goes back to something that we've seen in both reports or both research projects. Students have a very clear sense that institutions are interested in PR and how they are perceived more than they're interested in student safety. This is a perception that comes out of almost every student that we have asked. So participants proposed a lot of alternatives and grassroots student initiatives. So that includes implementing the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls for action from numerous processes. And this is so key. It's very important that this came out as such a priority for so many people. And people have expressed it in connection to critiques of policing, the RCMP, involvement on the West Coast, and all kinds of ways that people are now engaging with this set of approaches to anti-violence work as sort of centered in the anti-colonial work that is happening. Other calls, more BIPOC counselors and peer mentors, more funding for student-led peer support initiatives, more extensive bystander training on alternatives to calling 911. And as a former bystander program coordinator at a university, I can tell you that this is possible. It's been done, it's awesome, and students really respond well to it. Pay activists and advocates. Train grassroots groups on how to properly document instances of gender-based violence if you go outside of the criminal justice system or the pathways of the institution. And support student advocacy and community care practices. So, once again, students really resonate with each other on how much more we could do with the resources that, that we have if they're allocated differently and with a broader, more community-based approach to prevention. So this is where I see the most potential for this work going forward, is not necessarily in everybody knowing everything about the history of abolition movements right now, but there is some very exciting data that we have to share. One of the most validating set of responses that we saw was we asked students what made people feel safe, and the highest rated item was seeing student survivors and activists, right? So that visibility of advocacy work and students pushing back and creating space for survivors, that was what was the highest rated thing that made people feel safe. So things like security guards or better lighting were much lower on that list. So here I just want to show you a couple of the quotes and then I'm going to wrap it up. I know I may be over time, but I'm really grateful to people for your engagement in this work. So some of the quotes articulate, the anti-racist and anti-colonial dimensions of their critique of security. Lots of people believe security need more training. We need to divest from that and listen to racialized students and students who've experienced gender-based violence. Preventative education, listen to survivors. Some people do say security helps them feel safer. Racial profiling, that problem. And this is a very long quote, but I have reproduced it here because I think that there are a lot of things that are expressed. It's just a good example of like, here's a laundry list, let's get working. So, what can we do with this other funding? And then there are some people who express other frameworks, like, once you hire someone who isn't like a white dude as a security guard, suddenly people disclosed way more sexual assaults. That was one person's experience on their campus. So they're sort of gesturing towards the importance of, different forms of equity hiring as people move into a more critical position. And lastly, it's not a system that works for anyone except those who support white supremacy. I just want to sort of end with that quote, especially given what's going on in Ottawa and across the country. In Windsor, there's blockades at the bridge right now on the border. That movement is showing us the connection, even to what we're talking about here, and why we need to move forward. So I will leave it at that. I just want to let you know, I'm very excited to be here, and I'm very excited to be working on this issue. I think if people want to get together and do some work on this as an SFCC project, I can see that being a great place to go next. I just want to say that securitization relies on the very systems that uphold rape culture, that uphold racism, colonialism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and prevent real safety. So it needs you to be isolated from one another, to doubt your experiences and your analysis, and to defer to some authority that supposedly knows better. And to that, I just say, trust your gut. You don't need to be an expert. You have expertise in your own experience, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. We can organize together, and we can organize our way out of this. You don't need permission. This is the other thing. You can do it yourselves, and this DIY idea, it's very powerful at this moment in time. Let's work together, and let's organize. I will just end it on my Why Now movement inspiration collage, and say thank you to you. And again, I do want to thank people for sticking around, because I also believe that there is a lot of important material being exchanged here, and I do want to go into the chat and read it now. So thank you so much for your engagement. I'm going to pass it now to a presentation I'm very excited to see by Naomi Ibiyama and Gurmeet Kaur, a discussion of the culture and perspectives on a sexual assault policy project from Nova Scotia. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Emily. Good afternoon, everyone. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of Mi'kmaq people. We would like to thank everyone here today, and special thanks to Norma for sharing her insights. Now, I'll give forward to Naomi introducing herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Naomi. I'm part of the CAPSA project. We're here to discuss the findings from the project. I worked as the research coordinator during the CAPSA project. And it's been such a great opportunity being here. Again, we also would like to thank Norma for speaking and sharing her culture with us. And this has been a very beautiful learning platform for me.
So here we are. We would like to thank our funders and organizers for organizing this for us today. I am Gurmeet. I'm a research associate with CAPSAP 2022 since 2019. And here we are presenting to you in terms of what CAPSAP looks like. This is the protocol today we'll be following, right from introduction to conclusion. So what is CAPSAP? CAPSAP is culture and perspective on a sexual assault policy. CAPSAP study was conducted in 4 universities in Nova Scotia Various student perspectives on university sexual assault or sexual violence policies were obtained for the study, thereby addressed as sexual violence SV and sexual assault SA. The study's goal is to produce data that will help university-based service providers and administrators provide sexual assault services that are tailored to the needs and views of culturally diverse student groups. You have been given handout. Can you refer to that for more details, how and where the study took place, to keep it short and brief today? Looking forward to the methodology. In phase 1 and 2, that commenced from 2018 and lasted till 2020, we had about 42 focus groups held at Cape Breton University, Mount St. Vincent University, Dalhousie University, and St. Mary's University, representing 14 cultural communities led by peer facilitators. Participants and facilitators shared the same gender and cultural identities. Participants learned about and discussed their sexual assault policy. Based on the grounded theory analysis, recommendations were made for each university. This was done in a semi-structured interview. Moving on to phase 3, from 2020 to 2021, where participants learned about their university's sexual assault policies and reflected on transcript passages pertaining to their culture in an art-based workshop. And you would be amazed to see that we had 500 transcript passages from which the artwork was based on, and which led to the formation of a website, which is currently being developed as a part of phase 4 in 2022, that will act as an information resource for service providers and staff that are involved in sexual assault policy work at their universities. The domains that have been reserved for this work are capsap.ca and supportsurvivors.ca. To look into more, what were the focus groups like, you can look into below the screen. The settlers community comprised of Canada, USA, and the UK, the Caribbean, Middle East, East Asia, South Asia, Chinese, North India, South India, African Nova Scotian, European, East Africa, North Africa, Egypt, Southeast Asia, and West Africa. Moving forward to international students' perspective on sexual assault, which was one of the themes that we realized during this research. Let's look at some of the participants, what they had to say. We are sharing a direct quote so that it gives us an insight of what the participants felt like and what they had to say. A female participant from West Africa says, "I spent a significant majority of time in West Africa, like different countries, and I would notice the behavior in students and teachers are just among students and other students. The behavior would be like, they touch you, but then if you get annoyed about it, they would say, oh, I'm just playing. You're not just being so sensitive." So when I went to North America and observed also schools in Europe, when I shared those kind of stories, they'd be like, that's not appropriate behavior at all. And I'd be like, oh, I thought that was a normal thing. I guess it's just different depending on where you are from and how the situation is handled. So yeah. Another certain Indian female participant states her experience as follows. I think we may have different boundaries than others. I think it's just getting an idea about where our boundaries are. Obviously, we don't have the same viewpoints like maybe our grandmother did or does, but it is evolving. And so it may not be the same as what is happening in Canada, right? I think it may be a way to get an idea of what our boundaries are and what we consider to be sexual violence, which is so empowering to understand their viewpoints. And now my friend Naomi will continue.
Thanks, Gomit. So another topic that came up during the focus group was education and awareness. So the participants agreed that it was critical to enlighten international students on the university's policies, Canadian laws, and most importantly, what constitutes as sexual violence. So these are some of the quotes from participants during the focus group. So we had a North Indian female participant mention that it's so important for people to understand that something as simple as sex education of what's a good touch and what's a bad touch can make a difference. Something as simple as that. There are many times that you have someone touching you and you let it go because you won't understand if that person is just being open. Because for some instances, you think people are just way more open and they are more intimate with people, and you may not be comfortable with that. We also had a South Indian female add. I think maybe they could add to the sexual assault policy some tips of how, if you find yourself in a situation you find unsafe, or if you feel like you are currently being verbally or sexually harassed, if you feel like you may be sexually or physically or sexually harassed, or whatever, like a couple of tips or advice, or maybe plan of action that could be laid out so that you are in a so that if you are in a situation and you don't feel safe, these are the things that you should do. We also had a female participant from China notes. We should have a presentation introducing the policy in each orientation. It is possible that the school introduces this in orientation when all the new international students arrive at school, because I believe there are lots of different cultures in the world. People may not know what the norm is in Canada. They might do something they are used to and they didn't know that they are breaking the law. And lastly, we had a West African participant say that I think exposure plays a big role in this. Because if we were back at home, let's say, and things like this happen, because most of this is normalized, you tend to say, oh, you know what? Let's just keep it in a low key kind of thing. And let's not even talk about it, because most of these things are taboo type of things. Participants expressed that the dynamics depicted on the previous slides typically silence students who know that they have been sexually abused. Moreover, many victims/survivors do not even realize when they've been assaulted, according to the participant, and that is due to the normalcy of behaviors, which is considered sexual assault in Canada rather than their home countries. Students coming into Canada have preconceived notions on what constitute as sexual assaults and what their sexual liberties are. And these ideas may not align with the Canadian laws and policies. So as a result, education and awareness are critical, since international students need to be educated on their sexual liberties and what constitutes as sexual assault. It would be useful to use multiple formats to deliver accessible education about the Canadian sexual assault laws and how they work in practice during orientation, or at least once per semester. So we go into survivor's dilemma. So we had a male participant from North Africa, specifically Egypt, that said, in our culture, sexual assault is considered one of the taboo subjects. It is never talked about. Victims have to suffer through it alone, in silence, which makes it harder. So I think it definitely needs to be more accepted in society. We should talk about these things more openly so that the victims feel that they can voice their opinions and voice what happened to them. We also had another male participant from North India say, people from my culture are generally not vocal about sexual assault. They really believe that it can deteriorate their reputation in their community. These are some of the illusions that have infested the people from my country for a pretty long time. It is very difficult to change this at this point. So just taking proper steps, like I can raise my voice or be vocal about this difficult thing they have undergone, and it could help them a lot. Mostly, it's all about giving them the strength to speak out. So these are some recommendations that we had to address the survivor's dilemma. 1, we have to encourage international students leaders to complete bystander prevention training and training to receive a disclosure. We also have to create a peer support network under the guidance of mental health workers. And then we have to dedicate a small scale of study to finding ways to engage men in discussions of sexual violence across cultures. Go, Meeks.
Coming to the conclusions, the following are some of the recommendations that were made during the CAPSAP study phase 1 and 2. Firstly, it's cultivating a cultural sensitivity and anti-racism among university staff delivering sexual assault support, something that we see earlier in Emily's work as well. Disrupting patriarchal attitudes towards sexual violence that exist worldwide. Review policies and develop education and awareness material in light of culturally relevant information, which was the highlight throughout the study. Familiarizing and informing students with respect to their university sexual assault policy. Last but not the least, ensuring that the university has cultural representation from various cultural regions to provide sexual assault supports. There have been a bunch of more recommendations which will help ahead in making policy, but these were something that stood out. We felt that in due respect to the time we all are sharing today to discuss and share it with you all. And thank you from myself and Naomi and our principal director of this research, Kellyanne from Nova Scotia. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much to our presenters and to Norma, especially for setting up such a beautiful way to begin our conference. But also thank you so much to the persons who have raised really important discussions in the chat about accountability and how we truly make a decolonial space and what that looks like in practice. I'm Kelsey McCready, and I will be facilitating the question and answer period for the first presentations. I am the advocacy lead at Student for Consent Culture Canada, as well as a graduate student in human rights at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. So in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to post some questions that are for specific presenters, as well as more broad ones. And in the interest of what has happened today, I also want to invite the organizers if they'd like to take some time before we jump in to address the situation, or if we'd like to move forward.
I certainly welcome anyone of our team and anyone from SFCC to come in. This is Linda. I did want to share with people that I was very fortunate to connect with Norma Jacobs, and we discussed whether we would have our discussion together now. She had to go to pick up her grandchild and said that she is open and is going to think about having that discussion tomorrow, though, when she joins us. So I did want to share that, but I was able to give my apology directly to her in person and to check in terms of what she would like to see happen now in terms of a go forward.
Perfect. And with that being said, I will be moving into the question and answer portion. And the first question is for Tia and Kelsey specifically, but anyone of the presenters can jump in as well. How can we help to advocate to implement better policies for survivors that hold perpetrators accountable? For example, athletes still get to play in games if the survivor doesn't want to make a police report. We can understand why someone would not want to make a police report, but that doesn't mean the perpetrator should not be held accountable at the school level. Hopefully an incident would be workplace harassment and the workplace would take action, regardless of a police report or not. So is there a way to help survivors and hold perpetrators to account in this situation?
I am just reading the question again to make sure that I understand it, but I will yield to anyone else, any of the other panelists who have anything to say and answer that.
So essentially, I think what this person is asking, at the school level, what can be done to hold survivors to account, especially if the survivor doesn't want to make a police report?
Yeah, so, go ahead. Go ahead,
Tia.
I was just gonna say really quickly, like there are lots of different kind of processes that exist on campuses. So in my experience working on the Carleton University campus, we had kind of a flow chart that showed the different avenues that a survivor has specifically on that campus, and it's going to differ from campus to campus. So obviously if you're located in Ottawa or Hamilton, you'll have the police services, but for lots of different reasons that we won't get into, that's not the choice of a lot of or some survivors, like to go with the police reporting route. But there's, which is the reason that we really advocate for a standalone sexual violence policy on campuses, because that allows for a separate, like a different side of the flow chart, where an institutional kind of report and process happens separately from the police. And then there's other parts of the policies where those, if you choose to go both routes, how those intertwine. But we find that the question is really, how do we make those institutional policies at the post-secondary institutions survivor-centric, so that every step of the process, from the filing the complaint, the tribunals, or the that's not the correct word, like the investigation portion and all of those things, that there are safeguards for survivor, complainant, respondent, so that folks are not harmed in that process, to the greatest ability of the people involved. Yeah, that's pretty much all I kind of had to say, is that there's two different processes, and today we're focusing on the processes that we can control on campuses through policy and through those types of processes. But yeah, Gurmeet, you go.
No, pretty much what you have said, but what we have seen through our research is that participants were looking more into reporting. So how can reporting be made more, how can we create more awareness around reporting is actually what we are seeing. So in future, if something like that comes across, reporting to the right kind and right channel will help, rather than if the person doesn't want to go to police, and then we can derive more supports which are required on campus and are accommodated for the person who went through that process. Yeah.
I would just say, start with being survivor-centered. So basically to support what Tia has started out with. I mean, if we build all of our processes to be trauma-informed and survivor-centered, that's the starting point, right? So we don't know. Sometimes people don't want the same things, or they don't want what you might assume that they want as survivors. And I've learned that over and over and over again, right? So even throughout our journey, right, and our healing, we develop different understandings of what we might need or what would be good for us. But having said that, we have to hold our community accountable, and that means you can't be part of the community if you continue to be violent and shitty. So I don't think it's not a question of people not facing consequences for their actions and for their violence, but it is also about having the people who are impacted be able to weigh in on what's happening. So there's a lot of talk about transformational approaches and transformative justice, that kind of work. And I think that doesn't always work if people are not really invested in it, or if they don't really have the sort of broader investment around it. It doesn't work if it's just one more process that people are going through in order to get back to where they were. Yeah, much bigger conversation though. Also, if I can recommend another book, this is very good. So it's a bunch of different essays and pieces. It's called Beyond Survival: Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement. And it's about how messy this is, right? And this group actually did a panel last year on 1 year later after this book came out, and that was really cool. If you can find that, awesome. So it's edited by Ajaris Dixon and Leah Lakshmi Pupsna Samarsina. So I just, we need to inform ourselves, but also you can't just dump in a transformative justice process because you've messed up, which, for example, at Dalhousie with the dentists, I think that is actually one of the things that happened at some point, was the institution was like, let's do this, and it didn't really help, from my understanding. Thank you.
Perfect. And I'm combining questions, just like looking at the time. So there have been a couple of questions that have come in asking about what happens prior to entering post-secondary. So I know there are a couple of people who have asked, like, what are some resources for K-12? What are thoughts on the lack of policies for K-12 students in this regard? And this is open to any of the panelists.
I can go quickly. So obviously Students for Consent Culture is primarily focused on post-secondary, so college and university students. And that's all of us are like, or have recently been post-secondary students, but this is something that has been emerging kind of everywhere, because it seems kind of obvious, like rape culture does not start at Frosh. It's permeated in the culture and obviously affects students who are in the K-12, like elementary, high school age. And when we talk about prevention, so I personally am like on the education side. I was the education lead at SFCC before I was the co-chair. And before that, I worked with like youth and stuff in the community in Ottawa around consent issues. So if we're talking about prevention, the greatest way to prevent people perpetrating violence is to educate them on what consent means, and like respect and all of these things, these very simple concepts when they're younger, so that when they get to be young adults in a post-secondary setting, they already have the parameters on how to like behave properly and how to treat their fellow students and community with respect and not commit violence. So yeah, with that in mind, I mentioned in our presentation about educational resources that we're creating. And again, a lot of those are going to be for student leaders on campuses to take back to their communities and create trainings with their fellow students. But we're keeping in mind, how can these things be used in a K-12 setting? It might just mean changing the content a little bit to make it more relevant and age appropriate and things like that. But you know, I see the possibility of the resources that we're creating for student leaders to be useful to like teachers in K-12 environments, or like community leaders in like youth groups and things like that. So yeah, it's something that we don't have any resources on right now, or research or anything like that, but it's definitely on our radar.
Are there any other thoughts from our presenters on this question? Right, so moving on, there are so many fantastic questions, by the way. If your question does not get called on today, like, please don't take it personally. In the slides, there are some ways to reach out to the presenters. So if you have other questions or want to follow their work, please feel free to do so. But combining questions again, there was one question that came up in the comments and also in the Q&A box about how to engage men in these discussions, especially when we're thinking of prevention, or how these are essentially formatted, and having a lot of difficulty engaging with male allies. Like, one person indicated that they had difficulty getting men to come to a workshop. So if any of the panelists have ideas on how to make this more effective.
I guess I can address that a little bit. I have worked in bystander education, which, you know, began in some ways as a way to address men's lack of involvement in anti-violence work and to sort of speak to men, the monolithic group, as people who should be taking some responsibility. I think there's a lot of potential, but I also ran into a lot of issues around like the gender binary, which has been like roundly critiqued even by students who are participating in the work. And as we started to unpack that and kind of undo some of that work, it's complicated to create the spaces that you need on your campus that are actually responsive to violence and to do the education work. Like, you can't do everything in the same space. So I think that, like, I personally was very surprised and impressed with particular kind of cis men who became involved in the work that I was leading. But, you know, I don't know what like the end is. Like, of course, men need to be more involved, but men need to do lots of things, right? And a lot of what we've been doing for so long has been focused on care, right? Caring for survivors. And I think that there's room for both types of work, but you know, engaging men, there's a lot of literature out there, right? And I think some of it is very problematic. But you know, there's things that work. And sometimes it's just not the people that do the frontline anti-violence work that we know and like, you know, benefit from, who are going to be the people that are going to lead that work, right? So very complicated set of questions, but yeah, I'm looking forward to the presentation tomorrow, basically.
I would also like to add that when we are talking about support groups and when we say that we have cultural representation from different groups, we are looking forward to having male representatives, because usually the consensus with male is they'll move in groups. So one of the leads, if we tap to them, that could be a potential resource and we can make them more a part of the conversation. That is what our research finding has suggested, that making the cultural representation, when we are making it's not just female, we are trying to include more males into that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Emily, it's forever like the patriarchal.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple words. What I was thinking about, it kind of goes back to the last question when we're talking about how do we engage students K to 12. I think that just as these children are growing up, teaching them about what does, like, not essentially not teaching them what toxic masculinity, teaching them that it's okay to show emotion, that it's okay to cry, teaching them all of those things that they are taught are not okay, I think is even a step in the direction of building that consent culture. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of the students that I taught in sort of anti-violence practica and courses at the university level, a lot of them came to this point where they were like, I just didn't know, like, why didn't we learn any of this stuff before university or college, right? And like over and over again, I kept hearing that, and it's so frustrating, right? To be like, yeah. And so one of the recommendations that came out of the Crucial Voices work was particularly around like sexual education, gender-based education, consent education happening from K up, right? So what Tia was just talking about. And I think that's where you start to develop that consciousness and that those changes, right? It's a long-term prospect. And by the time you get to like age 18 or 20, like, yeah, of course you can work with dudes, but like, you know, why now? Like, start when they're 5 is my thought.
All right, so I think we'll move into one last question before we go into the break period. And this is a bit of a bigger one, and any of the panelists are welcome to share their thoughts. So this participant indicated that they're fully supportive of I cannot talk today, my bad. Basically removing like security from being the core members of sexual violence prevention and response. But they want to know, how do we divest from our cultural and colonial system, and while ensuring that those who are the perpetrators are still held accountable? So again, kind of going back to a couple of questions back, but looking more at the bigger systems and how do we begin to address those in a post-secondary context? And it's a big one, so take your time. Even if any of the audience members have some thoughts, feel free to share those in the chat as well.
I mean, I'll just, I guess, say one thing, which is like, we don't have to dream these things up right here and right now, right? Like these questions are massive. And sometimes it's about creating the space and opening up the conversation, but also like learning more, right? Like it's not like this is the first time these issues have ever been raised, right? But this is a long-term project, right? So yeah, I'm just encouraging people, like there's lots of work being done across the continent, I guess I would say. So let's go find it.
Yeah, just what
Go
you
ahead.
said, Emily. Yeah, just what you said, Emily. Raising awareness, having that talk, making it everyday conversation, speaking more about feminist lens. That is what to help create change. It's not that today I can go and fight for everyone. It's not going to be that day, but it's a big moment. And researchers and forums like this that are educating us, creating more awareness, where the dialogue is going, I think that's what will create a ripple effect in future. So yeah, just to keep the dialogue going is what's more important.
That's a great start to a very long road of work. And on that very reflective note that all of us can take with us, we are now in the break portion of the first day. So we will have 5 minutes, do what you need to do, hydrate yourself, nourish, move, cuddle your pet. We'll be back here in 5 minutes for our panel on intersectional perspectives on campus sexual violence policies. So we'll see you then.